The dark brown horse stood like a living nightmare in the center of the auction ring, his entire body writhing with thousands of black flies that had claimed him as their territory. They moved across his emaciated frame in shifting patterns, so thick in places that his actual coat color disappeared beneath the crawling mass, transforming him into something that barely looked like a horse at all. The insects had made homes in the open sores along his spine, clustered around his eyes until he could barely see, and swarmed so densely around his muzzle that each labored breath seemed to pull them deeper into his suffering. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the outdoor auction ring, where dust hung thick in the air like a curtain between hope and despair. Weathered ranchers leaned against splintered wooden railings, their calculating eyes usually sharp for hidden potential in livestock. But now they turned away from the spectacle before them with expressions of disgust and pity. The auctioneer's voice, normally confident and persuasive, faltered as he tried to find words that might transform this walking catastrophe into something someone might actually bid on. The horse swayed slightly on legs that trembled with exhaustion, his ribs pressing so sharply against his skin that each one could be counted from the stands. Beneath the moving carpet of insects, patches of raw flesh showed where the flies had fed, where neglect had carved its signature into living tissue. His head hung so low that his muzzle nearly touched the dirt, and when he occasionally lifted it, his eyes held the hollow look of an animal who had forgotten that the world could hold anything other than pain. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, voices carrying the practical cruelty of those who had learned to see suffering as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Someone suggested putting the creature out of its misery. Another wondered aloud why anyone had bothered bringing such a wreck to auction at all. The bidding started at nothing and stayed there, buyers suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their boots or engage their neighbors in conversation about anything other than the nightmare unfolding in the ring. But standing apart from the others, leaning against a sun-bleached post with arms crossed over his weathered chest, Thomas Whitmore felt his breath catch as something impossible stirred in his memory. Despite the flies and the visible bones and the way this horse moved like a ghost of his former self, something in that broken posture spoke to him with a voice he thought he would never hear again. The silence stretched unbearably as the auctioneer's desperation grew, and that was when Thomas pushed himself off the post, raised his hand and spoke two words that would change everything. Sometimes a man spends years running from his past only to discover it waiting for him in the most unexpected places. And Thomas Whitmore had been running for 5 long years when fate led him back to an auction ring he swore he would never see again. His calloused hands gripped the wooden railing with the unconscious strength of someone who had spent decades working with horses, each line and scar on his weathered face telling stories of morning rides through dewy pastures and evening conversations held in the soft language that exists only between human and horse. He hadn't planned to come here today, hadn't even known he was driving toward the auction until he found himself parking his battered truck among the gleaming rigs of serious buyers who measured their worth in bloodlines and breeding papers. 5 years of solitude had carved deep grooves into his spirit. 5 years since the fire took his ranch and his wife Sarah in one terrible night, leaving him with nothing but grief and the crushing weight of survival when everything worth living for had turned to ash. The other buyers saw only what stood before them now. A man in faded jeans and work boots whose truck had seen better decades, whose quiet presence suggested someone who belonged more in the cheap seats than among the serious money. When the auctioneer's voice cracked with desperation as he tried to coax even a single bid for the insect-covered horse, their snickers and whispered comments about charity cases and bleeding hearts followed Thomas like shadows he had learned to ignore. But something deeper than logic or financial sense moved his weathered hand into the air, some invisible thread connecting his broken heart to the broken animal swaying in the center of the ring. The gavel fell at $50, a price so low it felt like theft. Yet Thomas knew he was the one being given something precious beyond measure. As he approached the horse, speaking in the low, gentle tones that came as naturally as breathing, the flies rose in angry clouds around his face. But Thomas barely noticed them. His entire focus had narrowed to a single point on the animal's left shoulder, where beneath the grime and the crawling insects, a flash of white emerged like a star breaking through storm clouds. His pulse quickened as recognition hit him like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat as he traced the familiar shape with eyes that had memorized it 20 years ago. A perfect crescent moon, distinctive and unmistakable, exactly where it had always been on the shoulder of a magnificent stallion named Storm, who had vanished in the flames that consumed everything Thomas had ever loved. The world tilted around him as impossible possibilities crashed through his carefully constructed barriers. Because this broken creature, covered in flies, could not be Storm, yet that marking sang with the voice of memory he thought had died forever. Sometimes the most fragile cargo requires the gentlest hands. And as Thomas guided the trembling horse toward his weathered trailer, he understood that he was carrying more than flesh and bone. He was transporting the ghost of everything he had lost and might yet find again. The animal flinched at every creak of metal, every whisper of wind through the trees, his entire body a map of trauma, written in scars both visible and hidden beneath the crawling insects that still claimed territory along his spine. Loading him required infinite patience, each step a negotiation between fear and trust. As Thomas spoke in the low, gentle tones that had once calmed Storm through thunderstorms and veterinary visits, the horse's legs shook with exhaustion, yet he climbed into the trailer with the careful dignity of something that remembered, somewhere deep in muscle memory, what it meant to be valued enough to ride rather than walk. The drive through winding country roads gave Thomas time to wrestle with memories he had spent 5 years burying beneath layers of guilt and grief. Every curve in the road brought back fragments of Storm, the magnificent dark brown stallion who had moved like poetry across pastures that no longer existed, whose intelligence had shone through eyes now reduced to ash and memory. Sarah had loved Storm almost as much as Thomas did, often found braiding wildflowers into his mane while humming songs that made the big horse lean into her touch with contentment that seemed almost human. Logic screamed that the broken animal in his trailer could not possibly be Storm, that 23 years was ancient for any horse, that the crescent moon marking was coincidence, masquerading as miracle. Yet something deeper than reason whispered possibilities that Thomas was afraid to acknowledge. Something in the way this horse held his head despite his condition, the particular tilt of his ears when listening, mannerisms so specific and personal that chance seemed impossible. His small rented property appeared through the trees, like a fragment of his former life, barely more than a cabin with a makeshift paddock he had built during sleepless nights when solitude became unbearable. Thomas unloaded the horse with the same careful patience, watching as the animal took tentative steps onto ground that might, for the first time in years, offer safety rather than suffering. Fresh water disappeared down the horse's throat in desperate gulps that spoke of thirst deeper than physical need, while Thomas filled the feeder with hay that smelled of summer meadows and better times. The horse ate only a few mouthfuls before exhaustion claimed him completely, his legs folding beneath him as he collapsed in the shade of an old oak tree, whose branches had sheltered other broken things through countless seasons. Thomas settled onto his porch with coffee that had grown cold in his hands, watching this creature who might be a stranger or might be the answer to prayers he had been afraid to pray, breathing with the rhythm of something finally, tentatively safe. Sometimes healing happens not in dramatic moments but in the quiet accumulation of trust built one gentle touch at a time. And Thomas discovered this truth as he began the delicate work of restoring life to something that had nearly forgotten what care felt like. The horse stood rigid those first mornings, every muscle tensed for pain that never came as Thomas approached with warm water and soft cloths, moving with the patience of someone who understood that rushing would undo whatever fragile progress they had made. Each day brought small revelations, as layers of grime washed away beneath Thomas's careful ministrations, revealing a coat the color of rich earth after rain, deep brown, with hints of amber that caught the morning light like buried treasure. The insects released their hold, reluctantly, retreating from wounds that began to close under gentle cleaning and antibiotic ointment, applied with hands that had once performed this same ritual for another horse in another lifetime. Gradually, the white marking emerged fully from beneath the filth, a perfect crescent moon that matched exactly the shape burned into Thomas's memory, positioned precisely where Storm's marking had been on his left shoulder. Thomas traced its outline with trembling fingers, his heart hammering against his ribs as recognition warred with impossibility. Because this could not be Storm, logic insisted with relentless certainty. Storm would be 23 years old now, ancient for any horse, yet this animal, while clearly aged and weathered, moved with the careful gait of a creature closer to 15 or 16. His teeth showed wear, but not the extreme grinding of advanced age. His joints creaked with stiffness, but not the bone-deep arthritis that would claim a horse in his 20s. The mathematics of years refused to align with the evidence before his eyes, yet doubt gnawed at Thomas's carefully constructed skepticism. It was the small things that shattered his defenses, mannerisms so specific and personal that coincidence seemed impossible. The way the horse tilted his head when listening, left ear swiveling slightly forward while the right remained alert to sounds behind him, the particular way he favored his left front hoof, not from injury but from an old habit of resting his weight when standing still. The gentle whicker he made when Thomas approached with food, a sound that echoed across decades to settle in Thomas's chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. During grooming sessions, Thomas found himself holding his breath as muscle memory surfaced beneath his hands. The exact curve of shoulder blade and ribs, the sensitive spot behind the ears where this horse loved to be scratched. Each familiar response sent shockwaves through his certainty, because Storm was dead, had died in the fire that took everything. Yet here stood living proof that some miracles disguised themselves as impossibilities. The horse began to seek his touch rather than endure it, leaning into the brush strokes with contentment that spoke of remembering what kindness felt like. And Thomas found himself whispering the name he had not spoken in 5 years, testing it against the silence like a prayer he was afraid to believe. Sometimes the deepest truths hide beneath layers we never think to look beyond. And it was while brushing through the horse's thickening winter coat that Thomas felt his fingers catch on something unexpected, a raised pattern of scar tissue that spoke of ownership and identity burned into flesh with deliberate permanence. The brand was faded and partially obscured by the dense hair that had grown over it through seasons of neglect, but Thomas could make out enough of the angular letters to know this marking held secrets that might unlock the mystery consuming his thoughts. The brand was unfamiliar, not the simple circle and bar that had marked Thomas's own horses, but something more complex that suggested a larger operation, someone who valued this animal enough to claim him with fire and iron. Thomas traced the scarred letters with growing urgency, understanding that this mark might be the key to proving what his heart already knew, but his mind refused to accept. Sleep became impossible, as Thomas found himself driven by a certainty that defied logic, spending long nights making phone calls to old contacts scattered across the horse world, voices from a life he had abandoned after the fire took everything that mattered. The conversations were awkward at first, filled with condolences he had heard too many times and questions about why he had disappeared so completely from the community that had once defined him. Gradually, piece by painful piece, the truth began to emerge from memories clouded by smoke and chaos. Several horses had indeed been saved that night, pulled from burning stalls by neighbors and firefighters, who arrived too late to save the barn, but in time to rescue some of the animals trapped inside. In the confusion that followed, with Thomas hospitalized for smoke inhalation and grief, the surviving horses had been sold quickly to out-of-state buyers, their identities scattered and records poorly kept in the aftermath of disaster. What shook Thomas to his core was learning that among the missing horses was a dark brown stallion with a crescent moon marking, sold to a man named Garrett Mills, who ran a breeding operation in Texas before losing his license for animal neglect and abuse. The timing aligned perfectly with Storm's disappearance, and suddenly, The brand on the horse's shoulder began to make terrible sense. Thomas spent hours staring at the faded letters, understanding now that they represented not care, but ownership of the worst kind, the mark of someone who saw horses as commodities rather than companions. The horse standing in his paddock carried not just the scars of neglect, but the evidence of a journey through hell that had begun the night fire consumed everything Thomas had built. As he watched Storm, for he could no longer deny the horse's identity, grazing peacefully in the morning light, Thomas felt grief and rage war within his chest. Storm had survived the fire only to endure years of abuse at the hands of someone who should have treasured him, and the weight of that knowledge settled over Thomas like a debt he could never fully repay. Sometimes the worst truths reveal themselves not in thunderclaps but in the methodical accumulation of evidence that builds into a nightmare too detailed to deny. And Thomas discovered this as he followed the paper trail of Garrett Mills through veterinary records that read like a catalog of systematic cruelty. Each document painted another stroke in a portrait of abuse so calculated and relentless that Thomas found himself gripping his kitchen table until his knuckles turned white, his coffee growing cold as horror replaced hope in his chest. Mills had worked Storm relentlessly in an illegal racing circuit that operated in the shadows of legitimate competition, feeding him cocktails of drugs designed to mask injuries and push him far beyond his physical limits. The veterinary bills told a story of constant breakdowns and hasty repairs, joints injected with painkillers so Storm could run on damaged tendons, stimulants pumped into his bloodstream to squeeze performance from a body already crying for mercy. When Storm's legs finally gave out completely, when even the drugs could no longer hide the damage done to bone and sinew, Mills had abandoned him with the casual indifference of someone discarding a broken tool. The trail led through a series of increasingly desperate owners who saw Storm only as a burden inherited with purchased property, each passing him along like an unwanted debt until he ended up starving in a field behind a defunct stable, forgotten and left to die slowly under the Texas sun. Thomas read the reports through eyes blurred with tears and rage, understanding that while he had spent 5 years believing Storm was dead, the horse had been enduring a hell worse than death. His magnificent spirit, broken piece by humans who measured his worth only in seconds, shaved off racing times. The knowledge that Storm had suffered while Thomas grieved in isolation filled him with a fury so pure and terrible that sleep became impossible. Night after night, Thomas paced his small cabin, guilt over not searching harder, mixing with rage at those who had stolen Storm's dignity and nearly stolen his life. He replayed conversations with insurance adjusters and well-meaning neighbors who had assured him that all the horses died in the fire, that searching for survivors would only prolong his grief. How easily he had accepted their comfort, how readily he had buried hope along with his other losses. The photographs attached to the veterinary records showed Storm's deterioration over the years, from a still proud stallion bearing Mills's brand to the skeletal wreck Thomas had found at auction. Each image was a knife twist of recognition, showing not just physical decline, but the gradual extinguishing of the fire that had once burned so bright in Storm's eyes. As dawn broke over the paddock where Storm now grazed peacefully, Thomas understood that his horse's journey back from hell was just beginning, and that somehow, impossibly, they had found each other again when both needed saving most. The most profound journeys begin not with a single decision, but with the quiet understanding that some things are worth every hour of patience they demand. And Thomas discovered this truth as he committed himself completely to Storm's recovery, recognizing that the horse's spirit had been shattered as thoroughly as his body had been broken. The work ahead stretched like an endless horizon, requiring not just medical intervention, but the painstaking reconstruction of something far more fragile than bone and muscle: the ability to trust that humans could offer healing rather than harm. Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinarian who specialized in trauma cases, arrived on a morning when frost painted the paddock fence silver, and Storm stood motionless in the corner, his eyes tracking every movement with the hypervigilance of prey that had learned predators wore human faces. She moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that trust was a currency that could not be borrowed or stolen, only earned through countless small demonstrations of safety. The recovery would take months or even years, she explained, because Storm's wounds went deeper than the visible scars that mapped his hide like a geography of suffering. His nervous system had been rewired by trauma, his body trained to expect pain at every turn, his spirit taught that hope was a luxury he could not afford. The process became a dance of patience in setbacks, heartbreaking and beautiful in equal measure. There were mornings when Storm panicked at the sound of a truck engine backfiring, his entire body trembling as memories flooded back, his eyes rolling white with terror that belonged to racetracks and whips and voices that demanded more than flesh could give. Thomas would stand perfectly still during these episodes, his own heart breaking as he watched Storm relive horrors he could not name. But there were also moments of breakthrough that shone like stars against the darkness, tiny victories that accumulated into something approaching hope. The first time Storm took a tentative step toward Thomas, instead of away, the morning he allowed himself to be brushed without flinching, the afternoon he nickered softly when Thomas approached with hay. These small surrenders spoke of a spirit slowly remembering what it felt like to be cherished, rather than used. They began to remember each other through these gentle exchanges, not as they were in their shared past, but as they were now, both scarred and changed, but somehow still recognizably themselves beneath the damage. Thomas found his own healing woven into Storm's recovery, his guilt over the lost years softening into gratitude for the time they had been given to find each other again. Winter deepened around them as they worked together in the language of patience and presence. Two broken things, learning to be whole again, one careful breath at a time. Thomas understood now that saving Storm was not about returning to what was lost, but about discovering what remained, what endured beneath the weight of suffering, what still burned bright when everything else had been stripped away. Legal battles have a way of stripping away everything except the raw truth of what matters most. And Thomas discovered this harsh reality when a certified letter arrived, bearing the letterhead of a Dallas law firm and the name that had haunted his nightmares for months. Garrett Mills, now facing federal charges for animal cruelty, was attempting to reclaim Storm by arguing that Thomas had no legal right to the horse, since Storm had been legally sold after the fire. His ownership transferred through a chain of transactions that existed on paper regardless of the suffering they had caused. The letter transformed Thomas's quiet healing sanctuary into a battleground where lawyers spoke in cold clauses about property rights and legal precedent, reducing Storm's journey from hell to mere questions of documentation and proof of purchase. Thomas found himself forced to confront not only the complex web of ownership and identity, but also the deeper question that gnawed at his conscience during sleepless nights, whether he was saving Storm for the horse's sake or for his own desperate need to reclaim something from his lost past. Each phone call with his attorney felt like a betrayal of the peace they had built together, the legal terminology harsh and clinical against the backdrop of Storm's gradual emergence from trauma. Yet even as the legal storm gathered around them, Storm continued to improve with a resilience that humbled Thomas daily. His coat had grown glossy and full, rich brown catching the light like polished mahogany, and his weight had returned to healthy levels that spoke of steady meals and consistent care. More importantly, the light had begun to return to Storm's eyes, that spark of curiosity and trust that Thomas remembered from their earliest days together. He watched Storm rediscover that not all humans meant pain and exploitation, saw him approach the fence when Thomas appeared each morning, ears forward with anticipation rather than flattened with fear. The resolution came through science rather than sentiment, DNA testing that confirmed Storm's identity beyond any shadow of doubt. The genetic markers matched perfectly with samples Thomas had saved from Storm's early veterinary records, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence that no legal argument could dispute. Faced with overwhelming proof of his systematic abuse documented in veterinary records spanning 5 years, Garrett Mills quietly relinquished all claims rather than face additional charges that would have sent him to federal prison. The day the papers arrived, declaring Thomas's legal ownership. He found Storm standing in the center of the paddock, head held high as morning sunlight painted golden highlights across his restored coat. Thomas understood then that the legal victory meant nothing compared to what they had already won together. The slow rebuilding of trust between two souls who had found each other again across the wreckage of their separate hells. Storm nickered softly as Thomas approached, a sound that carried no echo of the broken creature who had stumbled into that auction ring covered in flies, but spoke instead of a future written in the language of second chances and the patient mathematics of love. Healing never announces its completion with fanfare, but arrives quietly in moments when broken things discover they can choose joy over survival. And Storm found this truth as he stood in Thomas's paddock on a morning when autumn painted the world in shades of gold and possibility. The transformation was complete, not just in his physical appearance, where muscle had replaced visible ribs and his coat gleamed with the deep richness of polished mahogany, but in his spirit, which had healed enough to trust again, to hope again, to find simple pleasure in grass beneath his hooves and wind threading through his mane. The rolling hills stretched endlessly beyond the fence line, green pastures that called to something wild and free in Storm's blood. Yet he chose to remain near the barn, where safety lived in the scent of fresh hay and the sound of Thomas's approaching footsteps. He could run now if he wished, his legs strong enough to carry him across those distant ridges, but he had learned that freedom meant choosing where to place your trust rather than simply running from what you feared. Thomas watched from his porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, as he observed the quiet miracle of a spirit restored. Understanding settled over him like morning light. The recognition that saving Storm had also rescued something essential within himself, proving that even the most shattered things could be made whole again with enough patience, love, and the stubborn refusal to accept that broken meant worthless. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees as Thomas approached Storm, with brush in hand, beginning the evening ritual that had become their shared language of care and connection. Storm's coat responded to each stroke with warmth that spoke of blood flowing strong and healthy beneath skin that had once been stretched thin over prominent ribs. The flies were gone now, replaced by the occasional butterfly that Storm watched with curious eyes, rather than the dull resignation that had once defined his gaze. As golden light painted the paddock in the colors of healing, Thomas understood that their journey had led them not back to who they were before their separate trials, but forward to who they were always meant to become. They were stronger now, more compassionate for having endured and overcome together. Their bond forged not in the easy days of youth, but in the harder crucible of survival and second chances. Storm leaned into the brushing with contentment that needed no words, his breathing deep and steady as Thomas worked methodically through his gleaming coat. They had both learned that redemption rarely looked like the stories people told, that it came instead in quiet moments of choosing trust over fear, hope over despair, love over the safer distance of emotional numbness. The sun touched the horizon as Thomas set down the brush, his hand resting gently on Storm's neck as they stood together in the gathering dusk. Two souls who had found each other across the wreckage of their broken worlds and discovered that some bonds are strong enough to survive even hell itself. If this story of resilience and second chances touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more inspiring tales of hope and healing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.